And thank you all for being so patient with us. I have the task of being the last presentation of the day, so please stay engaged, don't leave me. Um, but I will talk very briefly about my part of the study. My colleagues have explained very well the idea. Ilse started with the introduction to the project. Then we talked about Brussels, Greece, Belgium, Greece, and now the Italy aspect. My focus on the study was more on the Nigerian victims of trafficking and their trajectories. And yeah, I just finished my dissertation, so I had to put a picture in the corner. And so I'll just do, this is a quick overview. It's really going to be a short presentation so that you can finally go about your day, but also to leave some time for questions and answers if you have them. So my participants were recruited from three parts of Italy. So in the north in Piemonte, in the Napoli area, and in Catania. In Piemonte and Catania, they were recruited via NGOs and associations working with migrants, but specifically with victims of trafficking. In the Napoli area, they were recruited via my personal connections with some Nigerian girls who I know were trafficked into Italy and were at the time getting the care that they needed. So, I mean, I hope you saw, if you were here from the beginning, from Ilse's introduction, the study is quite robust. There was a lot of information. Even with Malta, Marina, and Ocean's presentations, they really tried to keep it as brief as they could, but we have a lot of data, a lot of information. So this is really just a condensed version of my study. The participants, I recruited 31 participants who arrived in Italy between June of 2016 and 2018. They all arrived through the Central Mediterranean route. They were all trafficked for sexual exploitation. 21 of them were adults and 10 were unaccompanied minors. And we stayed with the adults in the study as well because from what we've seen for victims of trafficking, there isn't much of a difference in the experiences of violence and trafficking that occur or the experiences that the minors and the adults have. They're actually quite similar, but also because some of the participants left Nigeria as minors, but arrived in Italy as adults because they spent a long time in Libya or ended up becoming adults after arrival in Italy. And so we interviewed both groups. There were 3 measurement moments, like my colleagues mentioned as well. So 31 participants participated in 2018 during the first recruitment period. And then the following, the M2 measurement moment 2, we had 22 participants and then 16 in the third measurement moment. There were a lot of themes. We started doing the analysis and a lot of things were flying out. Human trafficking, of course, was one of the biggest. That's the focus. Sexual abuse, rape, violence, stigma, discrimination, labeling. And so taking some time to unpack that and to take out some of the things to put into a dissertation, but also to put in our reports for our final recommendations. So I'm going to be talking very briefly about 3 of the prevalent themes in my study. One was family involvement in human trafficking. The second is sexual violence and the fact that sexual violence continues throughout the trajectories, throughout the migration trajectories. And the third is stigma and the prevalence of stigma, specifically sexual stigma. So family involvement in human trafficking, we discovered that this was such a prevalent theme. And we split the group into 3. So you had family members who were aware that their children or their wards were trafficking with a madame, a trafficker, and they were actually actively involved. They knew, they encouraged their children to go, and they were very much part of the process. Group 2, we had family members who knew that their children were traveling with a trafficker, but they were passively involved. So they didn't necessarily initiate the journey. The child informed them and they were okay with it. They said it's your decision, or they just said nothing about it, but they did not take the initiation. And then in group initiative. And then in group 3, you had family members who knew that their child was traveling, but had no idea that there would be prostitution involved, that there would be traveling with a madame, that there'll be any form of trafficking. And so this led to a lot of just the findings are very interesting. I mean, the family's reaction was also different based on which group they were in, right? If they knew from the beginning, if they found out after it had happened. And so you had family members who were very complacent, or family members who were like, well, you know what, that's the reality of life. Like, I won't read through the quotes, through some of the quotes, But in the first one, the participant says that she sent the pictures of what she had to wear in the winter to her mother and said, look, I'm standing in the cold, it's winter, my legs are burning from the fire that we light on the streets where we work, where we look for customers. I don't want to do this anymore. So all the money I'm sending to you, please make sure you build a house for me so I can run away and come back with my child. And her mother spent all the money and didn't build the house. And so the child said, that's when I started hating my mom, because she spent all the money, and after sending all this money home, I had no home. And so in her case, she was really, really angry about what had happened to her, and the injustice that happened. In the second case, there was a mom who did not know that her child would be taken for prostitution. And the participant says, my mother fought with the madam, and it was a big thing. She said that this was not the agreement that they had before the madam took her daughter to Europe. And the participant spoke of this with some sort of relief as well, that somebody believed her and that somebody was actually fighting for her. And then another participant says, I told my mom about the journey and she cried so much and said, no wonder I'm always angry anytime they ask me for money. And so this was after she finally told her parents about the journey. And you can see this was in M3. So it was in the third measurement moment of the study, going into 2 years, that she finally told her mother about what she had experienced. The second thing is that physical and sexual violence continued throughout the journey and after arrival in the destination country. So they left Nigeria, they experienced some violence, they continued into Niger, they were in the Sahara, they experienced violence. Sexual violence was throughout my study, it was one of the most predominant themes, the amount of rape and sexual assault that the participants actually experienced. And then they continued into Libya, and it just continued. And after they arrived in Italy, it didn't stop either. And that was a surprising finding for me because of the idea that they have arrived in a safe country, right? And for some of them, the violence continued even in the NGO, in the shelters where they lived in, which were supposed to be places that were safe and secure, and they were still sexually assaulted there. And so basically, this just shows that arrival in Italy or an EU country did not automatically mean safety. I think, so even though I skipped some of these quotes, I'm sure that Malta will email all of the attendees at the end, and then you will have the presentation. And they had their own survival strategies. They had the different ways that they coped with the violence that they experienced. Dating smugglers, even though they didn't want to. Some of them were forced to do that to survive. One of the things that a few of them did was really find men that could sort of protect them, whether it was a smuggler or a trafficker or another migrant that they could enter into a relationship with, who they felt at least being with this person will give me some protection, some security until I can get out. And this also happened in Italy, where participants said, at the shelter, sometimes they didn't give us enough food. So by having sex with one of the staff at the shelter, at least I was able to get food and provisions that I needed. And this came from outside the group and from within the group. So from outside the group, it was stigma based on their race, based on their nationality, based on their irregularity. So they were irregular migrants. They were considered to be less than others. They were told, oh, you're Black, so you must be smelly. And they were treated horribly by people who are outside the group. But then within the group as well, but I'll get to that. These are just a few examples. So they talked about experiences in organizations and with shelters where if somebody did something bad, people automatically assumed it was the Nigerian who committed the crime. And they said, even if we didn't do it, they automatically blamed us, or people found out they were Nigerian and automatically assumed that they were working in the sex industry. And even when this minor said to this older man who wanted sex, she said, I don't do this. This isn't what I do. If you want to give me a ride, I'll pay for it. And he said, well, you better get used to it because this is what your people do. And at the time, I believe she was 16. And this was a very regular occurrence where she was based. They also talked about being hard to find jobs because they're Black and because they're Nigerian, based on the same issues that I just discussed. And then there was also stigma and sexual stigma and labeling within the group itself, where within the migrants group, as much as they found a lot of support within the group, they were also secretive within the group towards each other. So it was kind of a mixed it was really mixed because they love the community, they laughed a lot together, they have fun together, but there's a lot of secrecy. Each person hides their secrets from the others because they feel like if they know, they'll use it against them. So for example, people who are children as a result of rape or sexual violence, they made sure, I mean, one of their biggest fears was that the other migrants would find out that their child was as a result of rape, because they would be mocked, they would be humiliated. When there's an argument, people will always say, like, your child is a bastard. And so she felt like if the child looks like that in any way, everybody will know. And, you know, I would be ashamed, and the child doesn't look that way at all. So she said that that was such a relief for her. And so they have adopted various coping strategies. I'm speaking a little bit fast because I also know that we've run out of time. But, you know, finding their own, and Malta talked about this in his presentation as well, you know, listening to music, finding different ways to cope, hanging out with friends, smoking, praying, drinking. And in some cases, they retaliated. If somebody went after them, like in the case of this minor, where this elderly man kept asking her for sex, she said one day she waited by the road with a bucket of water and poured it into his car. And she said, well, now he needs to go tell his wife how his car got wet. And she had a really good laugh about it. I laughed too, but they just found their own ways to deal with the situation and to survive under the circumstances. Another thing was avoidance, really avoiding locals on all things Italian, because they said, you know, they don't want us, they don't want to communicate with us. So I also stay on my own. I eat Nigerian food, go to a Nigerian church, have Nigerian friends, listen to Nigerian music. And so sort of a Nigerian, there's a word I'm thinking of here, but it's like a Nigerian microcosm, like right there in Italy. What'd you say? Bubble. Yeah, like a bubble, but they create their own Nigeria, even though they're not in Nigeria. So again, you know, we had all these themes. There was a lot to pick from, but in a nutshell, these are some of the main findings. And so in terms of recommendations, engaging with gatekeepers and members of the communities where these women and girls receive support is highly recommended. First of all, to gain access in the first place to the group, but also to be able to engage with the group in a meaningful way that's lasting as well. Providing adequate training for caregivers is also extremely important. People need to understand that by the time many of them arrive in Italy, they've already been traumatized severely, sexually violated, physically violated. Many have witnessed death, many have witnessed other people being raped. And so by the time they arrive, there's so much that has already happened mentally. And so that to help them to understand the coping strategies that they've had to adopt, but also help them to develop healthier coping strategies. I think mental health and sexual health support are not spoken of enough. And this is really, really crucial for people, for unaccompanied minors in general, for, you know, people who travel irregularly in general, but looking even more specifically at victims of trafficking, I think this is highly important. And last but not least is really creating policies and programs that allow these people, these women and girls, to provide input, because if the policies are for them and for their well-being, then it's important to create them in a way that they can actually feed input. And thank you for listening.